you, and thanks for having me. This has given me an opportunity to take some of the themes in my new book, which I'm working on, just to the next stage, and particularly for a group of people who are very serious about environmental sustainability and ecological problems. So let me begin by saying, long ago in ancient history, I was legislative director to a senator named Gaylord Nelson, who some of you may know was the founder of Earth Day. And in those days, it was possible to pass legislation which could deal with clean water, clean air, the whole raft of legislation that occurred in the late 1960s and early 1970s. That era is over, and it's over for a specific reason, which I think will open a door on this larger question. Gaylord Nelson, though an ardent environmentalist, was supported also by labor movements as most liberals were in that period. They needed to get support from progressive labor unions in order to do other things, in this case, environmental things. Labor union power in the United States and everywhere as a political fact of life has gone from 34% of the labor force organized down to 11% and 6% in the private sector and declining. The whole era of policy that I came out of and that was produced the environmental laws we now have is over essentially. So the next direction we take is clearly a different direction from the old environmental movement if we are to get ecological and environmental sustainability. And part of that involves transforming how we think about institutional power and institutions. And I want to stress that the relationship between a culture of ecological sustainability and the institutions, community by community, state by state, and region by region, are the key to whether or not we can build an ecological culture that can have sufficient political power to deal with the enormous challenges, above all, of climate change, but on many other fronts. So I want to stress the institutional question. And in a sense, that is both a design question, what makes sense, and it's a question of how to do evolutionary development of new institutions. So I want to come back to the evolutionary development process. But I also want to start with one of the most obvious and well-known interests of the environmental movement and the Next System project, and stress both support for one of the most interesting institutions, but also questions about it. And that has to do with a new interest in worker-owned cooperatives, which many people support, as do I. But it's important to understand there are limitations to this movement because they, in some places, have been romanticized and over-exaggerated as to their implications in general, and particularly for environmental issues. First, there are probably no more than 400, maybe 500 worker-owned cooperatives in the United States. Even the famous ones in the Basque region of Spain, some of you may know about, the Mondragon Corporation, are 4% of the Basque region. In the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy, which is another area of great interest, 5 or 6%. We're talking about over many, many decades. So far, it has not been shown that we can move this particular form forward in significant parts. Most people involved in the worker-owned development know this very well, that that's not a direction that we think can reach large numbers. So that I make that point because when people think about institutional design, we're going to come back to it, that is a primary interest these days, and it needs to be put in perspective. I am a great supporter of worker-owned cooperatives, but in many instances, it simply doesn't solve the problem we're about to address. Problem is twofold. How do you think about developing a culture and supporting through time a culture of ecological sustainability? What is it that brings together a community institutionally in ways that, to use an environmental term, internalize externalities? What do I mean by that? Take a community like my hometown of Racine, Wisconsin, a city of about 100,000. A company facing competition with another company, even if it's worker-owned, and certainly if it's not worker-owned, if it's facing competition, must cut costs. If it doesn't cut costs, it will be out of business. And that usually leads to very, very severe environmental problems because the easiest things to cut costs have to do with environmental issues. So there is an internal problem in a competitive economy that undercuts this. A design that might, what we economists call, internalize externalities would be when the community as a whole, for instance, and I'm going to give you some examples, might own worker-owned cooperatives, but it's the whole community in some sense that owns them. Then you get a different choice. The community can decide whether to pollute itself, or it can and take the costs, or it can decide to internalize these costs and say, no, we're not going to pollute ourselves. We're going to solve the problem because it is in fact comprehensive and integral. I don't know if that's clear, the difference between competing businesses that must pollute or their costs will be too high and they'll be driven out of business, or an institution like a city or a neighborhood, which itself owns industry and businesses and then chooses rationally that it can pollute itself or not. So that's a question of design, and it's a difficult one for most people to struggle with. But I think increasingly we're beginning to learn about this particular problem as one of the building blocks of the next system. And I use that term, the next system, because I think we are in a prehistory of developing what can become the next system in the United States and around the world, because the old systems are failing. So let me give you an example. Some of you know about the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland, Ohio. This is a neighborhood of about 40,000. It is a geographic neighborhood of about 40,000, very poor neighborhood. Average family income around 20,000 per family, about 20% unemployed, largely black neighborhood. But in that neighborhood, there is a community-wide corporation involving the whole community, to which worker-owned cooperatives are subordinated. They are part and parcel of the larger community structure. So it is a community building structure which can deal with community problems, environmental problems, growth problems as a whole within the community, rather than community firms, co-ops, businesses fighting with each other to cut costs in order to survive. So that's what you have there, and it's a very significant one because it's a large, one of the things they have is the largest greenhouse in the Midwest, capable of producing 3 million heads of lettuce a year. These are not little co-ops that are part of this. They have a large industrial scale laundry, the greenest perhaps in that part of the United States. They have a solar installation company. These are all worker owned, but subordinated to a community corporation that keeps the community interest first and foremost. In this particular one, there's also support to stabilize these businesses by using purchasing power from the big hospitals and universities in the area. The Cleveland Clinic is there, one of the largest, most famous in the world. The University Hospital System there is there, Case Western Reserve University. They together buy millions and millions of dollars worth of goods and services. So they can help stabilize not just the worker companies, but this community building structure that can internalize externalities, that can by itself begin to build an ecological culture. So there is a community building vision here. Rochester, New York is doing something very similar. They're in the planning stages for a community-wide vision which subordinates co-ops to a larger community building idea. And again, partly in the interest of building the whole community, rather than making some small worker-owned company successful. That's important too. But the larger vision is an ecological and a community building culture and the institutions that might support that. So I want to stress this particular line of development I think is happening in many parts of the country. There's experiments in Madison, Wisconsin, Austin, Texas, and many other cities. Richmond, Virginia is starting down this line, beginning to explore these more complex and integrated structures that have the possibility of weighing costs and benefits of the environment together and building community. So that's one issue I wanted to put on the table. The other is, if we're serious about an ecologically sustainable culture, the problem of inequality has to be dealt with directly, not simply in the old way when I worked in the Congress, which is hoping that taxation policies and raising the minimum wage, both of which I support, those are sort of after the fact structures pasted onto a system that is generating high inequality. How do we begin to build for the long haul systems that themselves internally reduce the inequality directly? So some of these firms that I'm talking about are like that since they're owned by the workers and part of the community, the ratio between top and bottom comes together in a different way. Now, corporate capitalism is famous for the extreme inequalities and the extreme concentration of income and wealth at the top. People don't realize that creates an envy machine and a growth machine. Envy because somebody is always going higher on the ladder and people see that distance. In fact, if your income doubles, the distance between people going up the system may get larger and larger, even though the ratio doesn't change. The absolute gap increases, or it's kind of an envy machine. So how do we begin to build systems that are not unequal and that do not drive consumption, do not drive waste, do not drive growth? And again, you're back to beginning to develop structure and not avoiding the structure problem, ways in which the structure itself might stabilize healthy incomes and increase ratios, reduce the ratios so that we have less and less gap that drives excessive consumption, excessive growth. Now, that's a very tough question. People in the environmental community interested in ecological sustainability know this is an important issue, but asking the question of how other than through trying to tax away the profits from powerful groups, do as much as you can, but we're not getting very far that way because of the power relationships. How do we build structures that inherently reduce this gap and thereby generate a different dynamic in terms of income distribution? And again, I want to put to the side, worker-owned companies don't help us much on this unless they're part of something larger. Like worker owners of the oil fields in Texas have a very different stake than the worker owners of the garbage collectors in Chicago. And the income distribution between those companies is very different. So we need to think about more comprehensive structures like the one in Cleveland or Rochester, the experiments in Richmond, Virginia that are community inherently encompassing. So I want to put that particular piece on the table, that if we're talking about an ecological culture that is sustainable over time, what is the nature of the economic institutions that nurture, generate, support, sustain, and expand that culture by virtue of their own dynamic, rather than being at cross purposes with the culture? That's one piece of the puzzle. The second line of direction, and this takes you in the direction of democratizing ownership, and democratizing ownership both through cooperatives, but also through these integrated new structures that are beginning to develop and experiment with the whole community. The second issue, and a very important one, has to do with growth and power. The dynamic of the large corporation, and again, this is one that the environmental community has not faced very directly in my experience, but I think is beginning to face it. We just had a major conference at Oberlin on sustainability and particularly climate change, and this issue is coming up again and again and again. This has to do with the power of the large corporation in corporate capitalist systems. It's worse in state socialist systems, so we could come back to that if we have time in the question, but we're talking about our own system now. This is no support for state socialism, which is worse on most environmental issues. A giant corporation has to grow. It must externalize costs. If it doesn't grow, it cannot go to Wall Street for financing, period. And if it doesn't grow and has excessive costs on any front, and mostly we're talking about cutting costs which have environmental implications, it has to cut costs because it's in competition both with other companies and also it's in competition for funds from Wall Street. So looking at the giant corporation from the perspective of an ecologically sustainable community raises very, very severe problems. The institution itself has a dynamic power. Now, as I said, the traditional answer to that was state socialism, which has its own failures and faults. But if we're talking about being serious about this, what is the nature of structures that would be more stable, that would be inherently community building, that would not have high dimensions of inequality built into them, and did not have to grow? That's not been faced. We're beginning to see a beginning discussion of this over time, building forward some notion of some forms of public, quasi-public, or public worker-owned complex systems that can be more stable and less ecologically driven by having to go to Wall Street. So the system that may take us beyond state socialism on the one hand and beyond corporate capitalism on the other hand has certain characteristics. And what I would suggest, again, in the time available, that we have to face exactly what are the implications of these large entities. And if they have inherent drive to grow, to externalize costs, and furthermore, to move around here and there, destabilizing communities, they cannot be part of the solution for a serious ecologically sustainable culture and society. So there are ways to begin to look at that. For instance, in the 1930s, there was regional development of the Tennessee Valley Authority. In its original vision, this regional public entity, which now exists in a very large form in the Tennessee Valley area, 7 or 8 states involved, in its original form was thought of as a community-supported public enterprise, mainly at power generation and ecological concern with the Tennessee Valley River, which was flooding regularly, that was supported by community control of a large economic entity. And I think if we look at that particular direction and many of the debates in that period, we're going to begin to see different ways to design and think through the structure of larger economic institutions. And I want to stress that for this conference in particular. People often are very fascinated with, rightly so, small-scale development. I spend a great deal of time, and we spend a great deal of time at the Democracy Collaborative and in the Next System Project, developing various community-based, smaller-scale institutions. But if we're going to talk about the environment in large and the crisis, particularly the climate change crisis, there is no way to avoid the large scale. So I want to put that to you as a challenge. Can we begin to ask questions about some forms of large-scale economic institutions that, unlike corporate capitalist institutions, do not have to grow in order to survive? If a big company doesn't grow, it will feel it immediately and stock will collapse, and stockholders will begin selling out. And there's a very, very severe drivenness to avoid regulation and to achieve profit growth. And on the other hand, the state socialist structures, so far as we've experienced them, are equally difficult because they haven't been responsible. So what you're talking about in these two levels are essentially systemic design questions and building towards a new design. I want to stress that point. We are actually, to deal with the environmental crisis, and certainly to deal with climate change, the institutional power questions at stake are so powerful, so direct, that we are talking not just about changing community design, not simply about building from the bottom up, but asking ourselves a challenging question. If you don't like the outcomes produced by corporate capitalism, particularly ecological outcomes, and if you don't see an obvious way to regulate them in the old ways, the ways I knew when I worked in the Senate and the House with the development of the environmental regulations, if that era is over, and if the state socialist model is even worse, then actually the challenge of an eco-civ vision is a challenge not only of culture, but of asking exactly what is the design of the next system and how do we begin to think about it directly, like an architect might think about designing, but also think about how it actually produces the results we want. I've given you 2 or 3 examples of systemic elements that do or do not work that are kind of illustrations of the problem. The Next System Project, which is housed at the Democracy Collaborative, is a project aimed at beginning to develop a sophisticated debate about these kinds of questions and projects that open up new directions and new illustrations, like the one in Cleveland, but many others. We've published some 25 different visions of how to structure the next system, many of them by leading environmentalists. Gus Speth, some of you know, is one of our leading environmentalists. Bill McKibben is supportive of what we're doing. Herman Daly's part of the project, saying we've got to get beyond the idea of only projects, which are critical. You can't get anywhere without projects. And only policy. You can't get anywhere without policy. To ask questions about the architecture of the system, the whole system. What does it look like? What would make sense? What would not drive growth? What would not drive the inequality that pushes people to grow and to expand? What would allow for stabilizing communities? The city of Cleveland, for instance, was 900,000. It's now less than 400,000. Why is that? Because the corporations had an interest in moving out from under to another community. So what happened to the people? They were dispersed. What happened to the capital? It was dispersed and lost in Cleveland, houses, schools, roads, highways, hospitals, and had to be built elsewhere at tremendous carbon cost as well as economic cost. How do we get greater stability becomes a design problem in an EcoCiv vision. So I want to push the notion and challenge you really to say, can we get beyond what I call projectism? My project is the best project and yours is not as good as mine, etc. To a vision of how we work together actually to ask logical questions about systemic design. And if you go to the website, The Next System, you'll find some 25 different competing designs, and people are getting quite sophisticated about this. And they're doing it in a way that asks practical questions. What does that have to say about what can be done tomorrow in this specific community in the direction that it should take? So I want to urge the opening of a much deeper argument about systemic change. We're going to hear later from good friends of mine about various visions of how to proceed. Partly, some of them are project-oriented, elements that build in a new direction. Some of them are more based on business visions. And some of them are beginning to ask, how does it fit together? And the how does it fit together question, in particular, is the systemic design question that I want to urge to you. Let me come back now to the question of how do we begin? So my first recommendation is for those who are serious about a serious, sustainable ecological vision, we must go to the system question, both at the level of community and at the level of larger scale institutions and larger scale dynamics. The second level is, where do you start? Well, one of the things that's important is beginning to say, somehow or another, power is related to who owns the institutions of a society. Now, that's pretty obvious to most people. But in a corporate system, it is pretty much a lot of the power goes with the corporations. I can testify to that, having managed House and Senate legislation, but anybody who's been in Washington very long knows how the system works in terms of the lobbyists coming in with lots of money and a lot of influence and a lot of information, helping to actually write the legislation and submitting it. And mainly corporate power is the big part of that. So if we want to change this is pretty obvious, and we could have a long discussion. What are the institutions that need to be, what is the direction we want to take? And then what are the beginning building blocks? If you look at most of the kind of literature on this, one of the ideas is who owns the society, who owns the wealth in the system. This is pretty obvious, but there are many studies that document it. Money counts. And so how do we actually democratize ownership of wealth? The top 400 people in the United States, this is a number that's staggering to me, have more wealth, 400 people. You could probably fit them in the room you're sitting in, maybe squeeze them together. More wealth than the bottom 180 million Americans taken together. That's a medieval concentration of wealth. It's extreme. Only I once gave a lecture saying that, and a medieval historian came up to me afterward and chided me for saying that. He said it was never that concentrated in medieval times. But one has to get a sense of how powerful that is. And so if we're talking about an ecologically sustainable society, an EcoCiv vision, that has to change. And in some sense, the key issue there becomes how do we democratize ownership in ways that also don't produce the outcomes of the socialist systems that we know about. And that means a lot of experimentation. I've given you a few principles. One, community-wide integration so that we can internalize externalities, the Cleveland model or the Rochester model or the Richmond, Virginia model, experiments in the direction of comprehensive development of this kind. But how do we do it at the national level or the regional level? What is the design that would produce equality, liberty, ecological sustainability, and above all, some sense of community, without the culture of community being nurtured and sustained from the bottom up? And that's a design problem, not simply a culture problem or an attitude problem. How do we build and sustain and nurture community building as a design of the whole system problem? That becomes that is an intellectual as well as political problem. We've avoided the question, if you don't like corporate capitalism, you don't like state socialism, what do you want? We've avoided that question as an honest and genuine kind of architecture problem. So I want to suggest that in your discussions of the rest of the conference, these issues be kind of put forward quite clearly as kind of design questions that we can handle. And I think that takes us beyond projects, very much beyond projects. You're going to find that there's an assembly of lots of good projects that are developmentally interesting and going forward. Co-ops being one, land trusts being another. City-owned banks are developing around the country. Philadelphia and Santa Fe are setting up public democratized banks like the Bank of North Dakota, which has been there for about 100 years, owned by the state, has different priorities. We're seeing experimentation all over the country in the direction of one or another form of democratic ownership, which gets you at the power base of a different ecological vision, changing who owns and who might oppose or support change. So that's very important. But it's important, I think, and I would urge this as another question to face in your discussions in the various discussions the rest of the conference. A starting point that introduces the notion of democratic ownership, whether at land trusts or whether worker-owned co-ops, is not the same as an endpoint, nor is it the same as a design. It may introduce in America the notion of democratic ownership as a basic principle. There are millions, 130 million people are involved in democratic ownership in the United States already. Credit union members are one part of that. Public utilities, which together with co-ops produce 25% of the energy. Many, many cable companies are publicly owned now. Land trusts are another example. City-owned banks are starting. They begin to generate a principle that itself is one of the baselines, one way or another, of a different structure that can sustain and nurture the values we're talking about. So I want to separate out, though, there is a question of design itself that often gets passed over in ways that I think are disastrous for anyone serious about ecological sustainability. And then there's a separate question of, look at all the possibilities that are popping up around the country of different institutional developments. They are likely to grow, but they don't all answer the questions that need to be faced by an eco-civ vision. They begin to suggest possibilities, but they suggest possibilities that have to be evaluated and reevaluated from the perspective of ecological sustainability, equity, community, stability, and a vision of a moral culture. They may or may not contribute on all those levels, even the best of them. So a serious movement, and what I think is most exciting about this period is there is a serious movement building up, experimenting, exploring, and beginning to debate, and beginning to think through these kinds of questions. It's the first time really in my experience, and I think in American history, where we're beginning to see things like the new economy movement, which is developing experiment after experiment after experiment, the next system debate, which is beginning at many different levels, and much of this not covered by the national press. So it's not known at the national press. You have to dig deeply to find out what's actually going on. It's not much covered by the local press either, partly because the local press is in financial difficulty, and partly because the local press isn't interested in these kinds of experiments. But there is a developmental process that's growing. For those of you who want some more information on it, let me give you a couple websites. The first one is community-wealth. Put the dash in, and that's covers many, many, many experiments going on around the country. The next one would be the New Economy Movement and the New Economy Coalition. Just those words will get you to their website. The Next System Project has its own website called nextsystem.org or .com. And you can begin to find things that are happening in many, many parts of the country that are not covered, that begin to show developmental possibilities in the directions that we're talking about here. So I would urge that you, let me put it in a different way. As a political economist and basically as a historian, in many ways, this period, I think, is one of the most important periods of American history for a very specific reason. I think we're coming to the end of the old ways of managing the economy. That is to say, the balance between labor and corporations to keep some sort of halfway equitable balance. That is really dying out as the labor movements have died out. And it's dying out all over Europe as well. That's what Brexit was about, the breakdown there. And that's what's happening in the European economies. The balance has changed. So I think we're going to go through a very, very rough period. But one of the features of the rough period we're already in, for people at the bottom of the system particularly, is the development and search for practical alternatives and search for a different kind of design. The notion that so this is a hard one, let me throw it at you. The notion that we're actually living in the prehistory of a transformation of the entire system is very, very hard for most people to grasp. That we, you and I, actually may have the possibility of helping create the preconditions for a genuine transformation, something that goes beyond good projects. I'm for good projects. And something that goes beyond electing good people. I'm for electing good people. But something that goes deeper to asking really tough questions about the values, particularly in this case, ecological values and values of community. What is the design in one community that will actually produce and nurture and sustain these values on an ongoing basis? That's the system question. That's different from projects. Asking that, and then asking secondly, how do we actually build up from the bottom up, but as well with politics as well, electing the right people who can begin to lay down groundwork for a further transformation. I'm from Wisconsin, grew up in Racine, Wisconsin. And if you look at what happened, particularly in Wisconsin for odd reasons, in the 1920s, experiments that became the basis of the labor movement, the labor law later on at the state level, experiments that became the basis of Social Security, experiments that became the basis of welfare programs and child support programs. These were developed partly in Wisconsin and California and in New York quietly in the 1920s and the 1910s. When the time was right, they became the basis of national law. They were the experimental kind of laboratories of democracy, as they used to call it, where the really important experiments and developmental projects were going forward. And they became, when the time was right, very important. So I want to suggest that way of thinking, not simply about, isn't this a good thing to do locally? Yes, that's the first question. But to ask the tougher question, am I looking at something that might actually help us change the whole structure of the system as we build forward? Asking a really tough question of history and citizen, and asking the question yourself, might this be, as I think it is, the prehistory, the developmental period, where large order systemic change may be in the cards if we develop carefully and concretely and with thought as well as practice the institutional base of that kind of a possibility. Might our own time contribute? Now, it's all positive in any event, the work that can be done at the local level, but the larger question, the citizen political question, is if you ask it particularly from an environmental point of view, particularly from a growth point of view, particularly knowing that it's very hard to regulate the oil companies, particularly knowing that they have to grow, what is the design that would actually achieve the outcome we want in the next era? And then simultaneously looking to the Bernie movement, looking to what number of people in the environmental movement are now getting very serious, bringing together those things together, laying groundwork for a transformative possibility. That's very hard for most people to do. One historian put it this way: most people like to remember the future. What does that mean? The way they think about the future, the way we think about the future, is that we often remember what we know from the past, and then we project that forward, assuming that will be what it is. So we remember what the future is. Now that works often when things don't change. It doesn't work at all if you put some of the most serious environmental values and values of democracy on the table. Then you've got to actually have to begin saying, what are the experiments that point in a new direction? How might it fit together? And how might we advance step by step? So I want to urge something that's very odd for people who are serious about politics and economics and making things happen. There are genuine intellectual problems at stake here. What is the nature of the system you want to build? Would it actually sustain the values you affirm? That's a really nasty question, because we like our projects simple. Where will it lead? And then how do we build step by step with others going forward? So the good news, as I said, is there are a lot of people involved in this now. It's very exciting in that sense, both at the level of project development, at the level of politics, and at the level of facing some of the most serious kind of design questions or intellectual questions, or what I call systemic architecture problems that we haven't quite been willing to face in large numbers. So I hope and I know your conference is going to get into this at both the project level and the theoretical level, but I want to suggest and urge that you ask yourself the toughest questions and then say, how do we develop over the next 1, 2, 3 decades the foundations for a transformative period in an era when the pain levels are likely to grow, when more and more people are likely to be asking tougher and tougher questions, and whether, unless we develop a positive answer, the dangers of a negative answer are all too clear for all of us to see. So I think we can leave it there and maybe do questions now at this point. Thanks very much.
20 minutes for open questions. If you want to just address Gar, maybe say your name and your question. The camera's there. He'll see you on the screen.
Hi, Gar. I'm Sherry Kling. I'm a student here.
Hey, Sherry.
My question is, in the models that you talked about the community corporations and then the worker co-ops and all under that, and you talked about communities then weighing the costs and benefits on the decisions. I'm wondering if you've seen an example or has it been thought about how something like that could be created where non-human entities are given a voice, and where entities that are affected by those decisions but are outside the community are also given a voice, like those that live downstream, and then the earth itself and the animals within the community.
Those are wonderful questions. First, let me really just affirm, those are design questions. You're asking a question about how would you structure a system to do what you just said. The answer is I have not seen anyone deal with the non-human actor within systemic design. So that's an open area for further discussion and for debate and for further contribution. The question of downstream is something that people have talked about. And it's a very good question. See, that's a beautiful systemic design question, because you can develop a coherent, democratic, and ecologically sustainable community, and it might pollute the river downstream to the next community. What is to prevent that? So that becomes, what is your design? Some people argue, and this is certainly part of the puzzle, part of the answer, the development of an ecological culture within one community can constrain a good deal of the downstream problem. And I think that's partly true, but I think it's only partly true. The next level of argument, and this you can find in literature on it, there's a famous ecological kind of communitarian named the late Murray Bookchin argued this. You need some form of structure that relates community to community, probably in some cases a confederate structure or a regional structure that allows this to be mediated, so that there's a power structure in which everybody works out a balanced act and understands that. That gets you to larger scale design. And there is if you go to the webpage, you'll find some of that is up there. And if you look me up, you'll see some references to some of the literature on that. But it's a perfect design question. I really want to affirm it, because it asks the kind of question that you've got to ask if you want to get beyond current. Now, currently, there's no answer to this. There is an attempt to stop pollution if you can regulate the companies. But when you can't, the downstream problem doesn't get solved at all. It gets exacerbated. But it's a really good question. Permit me, because I'll certainly digress from some of these questions, but I want to say one other thing about this. I mentioned regionalism, which is part of this. One of the problems that's posed by the downstream problem is this. Most people are not fully aware of how large the United States is compared with other countries. And it makes solving downstream problems really difficult. Let me give you an example. The United States, which is about 3,000 miles corner to corner, and 30 million people, is so large that you could drop this country of Germany, one of our competitors, one of our other European democratic economies, you can drop it into Montana and still have more land space around. Most people don't realize how very, very, very large this country is. So that means that downstream problems are very hard to mediate in a whole system that large. Most of the people who face this question, and there's a huge debate about it, both in the 1930s and 40s and then in the 1960s and 70s, believe that at some point regional structures, New England, the upper Northwest, different parts of the country, maybe California itself as a region, are going to have to be somehow empowered more regionally, and that within the structure of the region, many things, including the downstream problem, but many other planning problems, become more possible. But the problem of scale is, and again, I'm putting some of these really difficult architecture problems in, the problem of scale is a real one in a gigantic system. It's almost certain to be on the table over the next 30 years of how do you begin to decentralize. When I worked in the Senate, the Appalachian Regional Commission was established, which is a regional idea. And at the same time, 7 regional commissions were established to try to begin talking about regional solutions because of the scale problem. These were later dismantled during the Reagan era, but I think that's going to return again, the whole regional idea, in order to deal with smaller scale inter-community problems as well.
Yes, John Forney with Progressive Christians Uniting. I'm the father of a son who is a part owner of a workers' cooperative. The workers' cooperative is in Portland, Oregon, and they're a bicycle shop. When the Great Recession came, they were under a huge amount of pressure because Portland has no shortage of bicycle shops. And with the workers' cooperative, everybody is an expert in how to fix the thing. Why they're very good mechanics and bike salesmen, it seemed to me, looking in from the outside, that there was a problem with authority. No one would be willing to accept the authority of another co-owner in the shop as to what would be the best strategy. First of all, there was, and finally, there was no community-wide authority that would help these cooperatives, as there were several in Portland, work together. How do we, first of all, educate workers in cooperatives as to how a business like this can be best managed? What are best practices? And second of all, how do we deal with that question of authority? Because for progressives and liberals, we're all authorities.
Well, first let me say, I was analyzing worker co-ops before. I'm very much in favor of worker co-ops. I think they're very important, but I think they are not the answer to everything. And it's a larger scale, and you've just posed the larger scale problems, and I gave you some other larger scale problems. Sometimes you see people talk about worker-owned companies as if it's the answer to everything, and I think it's not true. So I think one of the things that has to happen, and is happening in many worker co-ops around the country, that there is education of how to run a co-op, how to run a worker co-op. This is not a world that people don't know something about. The Mondragon co-ops, famous in the Basque region of Spain, many of the internal problems have been sorted out in different ways so that there's participatory structures and yet expertise, so that we don't just have participation without knowledge. So this is a world that is developing and needs to develop more and more sophistication, but it is a world that's developing. So the internal problem, I think we've learned a lot about, and there's learning out there. And I think if you just go to the websites, you're going to find a whole literature and you can call people who are doing this and find out what's going on around the country. Just Google will help you right with that one. The problem that you've just posed about larger structure is the one I was trying to pose earlier. That is, to the degree worker co-ops fight with worker co-ops, they become more and more like capitalist firms and have to cut costs, in order to survive if the next guy does. And they're often environmental costs. The answer to that is some form of agreement or law or confederation or structure like the one I described in Cleveland, or the one that's being developed in Rochester, New York, or another one in Richmond, Virginia, beginning to experiment with the problem of authority or the problem of confederate agreement. That's another way to say authority. So that gets you right again to the design question. It's a perfect example of how do we produce designs that are both efficient and democratic, but make sense and solve this question. How they need to be, I've been talking a lot about theory, but the bottom line is they need to be very practical, and we need to experiment and develop things that actually work. So there is work going on in these different areas. So I commend it to you. And there's some wonderful work going on in internal design control, how to manage worker-owned cooperatives. There's a good deal of work on that right now in many parts of the country, many parts of the world, as a matter of fact.
Time for a few more questions, one in the front.
Hi. You mentioned like corporations growing and growing and growing. I was wondering, like, how do we start to challenge those corporations in like a non-violent way and to make positive change? Because as like a very kind of small community compared to these corporations, like, I'm kind of like baffled on how we can make change. So I was wondering how you would go about doing that, or your advice for like us as students and people. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's a great question. But so let me stress 2 or 3 points, because I thought a lot about this really tough question you've asked, and I don't know if the answer I've given myself will be useful to you. But here's how I begin to think about it. The first thing, if you're interested in this case, ecological civilization, you have to ask the principal question: can it be done without challenging the power structure and the dynamics of either a state socialist bureaucracy or systems, corporate systems that must grow and must cut costs? And I think the answer is no. You can't get there without challenging those principles. Now, the second thing that's pretty obvious, did you notice that the United States government nationalized General Motors and a number of big banks and Chrysler and AIG, the largest insurance company in the world, just a couple of years ago in the financial crisis? That did in fact happen. And it's not going to happen again, in my opinion, because of the instability of the current system. But what happened was, since there was no alternative, and since there was no politics demanding an alternative, all the taxpayer money went into producing something, was given back to General Motors and given back to Chrysler and given back to AIG. A political movement is part of what we're talking about. If it has ideas that it has thought through, we're in the prehistory of developing that kind of a movement. What Bernie Sanders has demonstrated is it's possible to build a movement. Putting together the experiments, thinking through the systemic design thing, this is what the prehistory of a large change is all about. So I suspect we're going to see more crises. That the big banks are doing almost exactly what they did before. The current nostrum in politics, and in Bernie I think is guilty of this as well, is, well, we'll break them up. And what we know from AT&T and what we know from other Standard Oil is you break up the big ones, and then what they do is regroup, and very quickly, and the power structure gains. So some form of public, regional, or national / worker / community design for how they're both anchored in community and also public models. I think that's the design question. That's one of the hardest design questions, because some things have to be big. I have lots of friends who are involved in the solidarity movement, and I often ask them, by the way, did you fly here? Who's going to build in the next system? Who's going to build the big airplanes? It's certainly not going to be a neighborhood project if you're going to do that. Or secondly, and so these are the design questions. I value what's going on in the solidarity movement. I think it's really important work from the bottom up. But sometimes these questions are not on the agenda. Or, did you use a cell phone? Who's going to build the rocket to put the satellite up that is part and parcel of that communication system? It's not going to be your neighborhood. So larger industry poses regional questions beyond communities and larger corporate structures. Under any system, public or private, you're going to have some things that are large. Or thirdly, how do you balance the economy so that something produced in one community doesn't destroy the market for the next community, so this one succeeds and that one dies? That's a planning question of some kind in the next system. Right now, we just throw away cities. In Cleveland and Detroit, 1 million people were thrown out of Detroit. Where did they go? Nobody cares. Same thing with Cleveland, 400,000 people. Jobs were gone. Where did they go? Nobody cares. So somehow planning for greater stability raises all these larger system design questions. But I want to kind of urge, take them. They're not that difficult if the complications come with the detail, but some of the principles are pretty obvious if we begin to think them through. And it is true that Bernie, I was surprised. I'm from Wisconsin and I lived in the Joe McCarthy era. And all of a sudden, here's Bernie Sanders talking about socialism in America, and people saying, sure, let's vote for him. So the possibility of much greater change as the pain levels in this country grow, I think are very, very real. And then it becomes responsibility for people like us to begin saying, what is it that we want that will get us beyond the failures of the past? So yes, I think there's even the big corporations. I think that there are going to be big questions about them, and certainly the big banks and the big companies do not have broad constituencies. Even the Tea Party folks are angry about some of those.
We have time for one more question. Anybody else?
Hi. What do you see, you're talking about these kind of small projects and how they can be good, but that they don't necessarily reflect this sort of large-scale systemic change that we need. What do you see the relationship being between these small experimental projects and then the sort of design questions that we need to ask and answer to create the change that we need? What's the relationship between those two things?
Well, that's a terrific question. It's a great one to end on. I'm not against projects. You get nowhere without projects. I'm against projectism. My project is better than your project. My project's the answer. So and a stance that both develops experiments and projects is really important, but also not denying that we live in large political economic systems that set the terms of reference. And the big issue, and I commend you for even asking the question this way, is to begin asking, how does it fit together? Does it make sense? Or is it just going to be a nice project? But not avoiding projects. You can't do anything without the on-the-ground experiments. I'm very much interested and supportive of experiments. But I think some people get lost in the notion that only localism and local projects will solve the problem. And I think that's a fundamental error. And I think that error leaves the power structure to do what it wants to do and lets us play in the margins. Experiments are necessary to develop and to develop the next politics, but it's got to be a politics that goes well beyond that, beyond experiments, even beyond local communities, necessary as that is. What do you talk? How do you deal with the system? But that's the system question. I think most people know that. I think I'm talking with people understand that we face a systemic crisis, and it's a crisis of corporate capitalism and state socialism. So that means that the local things have to begin, I think, be part and parcel of a systemic answer. Some people, I think both of the other speakers are very good friends of mine, don't like the design question. They'd like to stay at the project level. And I keep chiding them and urging them and conflicting, saying we've got to face the systemic design question. And what's exciting, if you go to the Next System project, thenextsystem.com or nextsystem.org, just get the words Next System and you'll find it. You'll find a really very rich debate going on amongst people who've been thinking about this from various different perspectives that begins to take and enrich it. And it's the kind of thing we need everybody to participate in. It's like the Federalist Papers at the start of the American experiment, in which people actually debated what is the design of the Constitution? Does it make sense? Will it produce democracy? So I think that's the period, and I think of it as the prehistory, not the history, the prehistory of the potentially great next transformation. And it involves experiments as well as ideas, as well as design questions. And I'm excited that you folks are beginning to deal with it at this level. It's a great conference and a great concept that you have here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.